I want to tell a little story about Senator McSorley. He's been in the New Mexico legislature, first elected in 1984. And as a youngster with a lot more hair in those days, I was introduced to him by Shirley Green. I worked at the New Mexico Conference of Churches, and we had a legislative advocacy where we advocated for a number of social causes. And Shirley Green took me around that roundhouse, as we call our state capitol, and he says, I want to introduce you to somebody. He said, here's one of the good guys. And I was a little skeptical about who the good guys were because I didn't know a good guy from a bad guy. But I shook hands with a Representative McSorley at that time, and we were working on a number of issues. And every issue that I worked on with the Conference of Churches, Representative McSorley was an ally. So I thought, well, he's looking more like a good guy as time goes along. And then in 1996, he decided to run for a vacant seat in the Senate at the time, and he was elected to the state Senate. And then for a number of years, he chaired our Judiciary Committee. And I'll tell you, from all the years I've worked for him, worked with him, not for him, all the years I've worked with Senator McSorley, I have on occasion disagreed with him. And one time I got so mad at him about something, I can't even remember what it was, I made a campaign contribution to his opponent. And he noticed it, but he didn't hold it against me. We've continued to be friends, and I've worked with him on this controversial issue. And this senator of ours, despite all the vigilantes saying he's not going to come, he's changed his mind. He's here, and he will not shy away from controversy, and he will not be intimidated. And as a matter of fact, I think I'll tell about the coalition days in the early days when he was in the House of Representatives. We were under the control of a conservative cowboy coalition. And I think he got in the doghouse at that time and ended up on some committees that had nothing to do with anything he was interested in. I don't know, was it agriculture or what? But he sat in the doghouse, and the coalition was eventually broken, I think 2 or 4 years later. I'm going so back in time, but anyway, the more progressive element took over the House of Representatives, and he got out of the doghouse. But we appreciate him coming, and I hope everybody will give him a warm welcome, and I'm sure you'll enjoy his remarks.
Thank you. I do find it hard to think of an issue we disagreed on, but I do revel in taking controversial positions. I'm happy to do it. I am sick and damn tired of politicians who are cowards. And but you know, the irony about this is, I've been thinking about this for a long time. I haven't even had an opponent since 2002. And the last couple of times I've had an opponent, it was all my Democratic leadership that put my opponents up to it. And then I beat them with 70% of the vote. So what has amazed me from the very beginning of my political life was I made a pact with myself that if this term that I was serving was going to be the last, well, it dang well better be my best. And so now I'm reelected for another 4 years because I've had no opposition. And I believe it's a tribute to my constituents. Every single time I have taken on the most controversial issues I could imagine, they've stuck with me. And I owe my constituents everything because of that. Welcome to the conference to all of you. I've followed with great interest the news. I was hoping there might be more cameras here because we could have an intelligent discussion. I had some ambivalent feeling about the Albuquerque Police Forum. On the one hand, I think everything will get better with the exchange of information. And I did feel for those few 5 constituents that showed up and couldn't get questions answered. Yet I thought that at least maybe, and of course I didn't attend because I just didn't have the time. This is a campaign year, and while I'm not opposed. I do have friends that I dearly hope will get reelected who I'm helping. So, I don't know what was said at the conference by the police, but at least it was another chance to have an intelligent discussion, I thought, and I was sorry that there wasn't questions and answers. What I also was amazed about was, and one of the things I want to say publicly is, I had heard that it announced on the news is that this conference was coming and that there were people that were very upset and enraged and God knows what, and so that there was going to be this public forum. And at first I thought, oh gosh, is this going to be another wave of hysteria? And only 5 people showed up. Well, if every time I have a meeting in my neighborhood and 5 people showed up and and all the news cameras would come and let my 5 constituents be heard, this would be a better place. But there seems to be an agenda hidden here that my 5 constituents never get heard. And for that, I think that we all ought to notice who gets heard on the news and who doesn't. If it's more hysteria and more blood, the more news you get. If it's more intelligent and less hysteria, you never get to see it on the news, and it's a shame. So everything that I do, and by the way, for most of my 28 years, I have been chairman or vice chairman of Judiciary Committee, both in the House and the Senate. So I have been at the vortex of all of these issues for almost my entire 28 years. And it is true that I was in the minority those first couple of years, and now I'm in the minority again on the progressive wing of the legislature. And I was in the minority because I took a principled stand, and although I come from urban setting here in Albuquerque, the University of New Mexico, I was put on Agriculture Committee. And I publicly announced that I must be on agriculture because the biggest cash crop in my district is cannabis, and so I presume the Speaker of the House wants to legalize cannabis. That was my only explanation. So, you know, it makes me happy to piss people off like that. And in fact, I can remember the now defeated Speaker of the House who I crossed swords with many times. He said, you know, your problem, you tell the truth to too many people. Quote unquote, that's my problem. That's why I've never gone further in politics. I have another explanation is I don't take money from most of the biggest money givers in America. And so I don't, it gives me the freedom to represent my district. So my job as I've seen it over the last 28 years is to try to shape public policy. I am not a judge, and although in my private life I'm an attorney, I don't do criminal law, so I cannot tell you what is right or what is best in any individual case. But I do have the ability to form public policy. And in the case as it relates to sex crimes, we have huge competing and legitimate forces. Okay, to me, what are the 2 greatest competing forces we have? One is protection of the general public. And second is treatment for any individual who's been a victim of a crime. Those 2 things we are failing at right now, as I see it. There is a third component to this, which I struggle with every day also, but which the general public seems to have totally missed the connection to, and that is the money. Every single time in America, in my public life of 28 years, that there's been a new law enacted, it has been an unfunded mandate. That in effect, either Congress in the Adam Walsh Act or the state legislature has told a governing body below them, now this is what we are going to require you to do, and we are not going to give you the money to do it. And so consequently, when we do that, we cheapen our own existence and our legitimacy. And as I've done this in a public policy forum, I have watched my colleagues all struggle and all worry. But as was mentioned earlier, we had a great bill 2 years ago. You have to understand, in the New Mexico legislature, we can only do general bills like criminal bills every other year. So this last year, we couldn't even bring the bill up again. And we got it through the New Mexico State Senate. And quietly, many, many senators were telling me over and over again, if you can make this as non-controversial as you can, I will vote for it. But if somehow you grandstand on this issue, then we'll have to withdraw our support. So while I am happy to do what I need to do, I try to do it with a little deftness if I can. And we got all the way through to the floor of the House. And there was one other problem with this bill that caused it to fail, I think. It faced a certain veto. The governor was certainly going to veto it. Our governor is a former district attorney. She made her life being tough on crime, which, by the way, meant she hurt many, many victims doing it by focusing on what she was going to do to perpetrators and not how she was going to help victims. I saw it over and over again. I saw her accuse innocent people of crimes. I saw her persecute innocent people of crimes. And I saw DNA exonerate those very people that she persecuted of those crimes. And let me tell you, just so you all know, I am the father of DNA in New Mexico. When legislators over and over again couldn't get it passed. Fortunately, as a young man, I lived in South America, and I know all about the history of DNA. For those of you that don't know, it was started by American scientists in Argentina when the disappeared youngsters that were fighting against the Argentinian dictatorship were buried in mass graves. After the dictatorship was overthrown, they were trying to figure out who these bones belonged to. And that's when DNA got started. You all probably don't know that. And so I saw this going on, and I have a very deep connection to South America and the people there. I knew many of the people who lost loved ones in these coups. And so I saw the value of DNA. And I see it on two levels. And again, this is the public policy that affects your lives so intimately. DNA not only identifies who is present at a crime, but it exonerates everybody else. So to me, that's the perfect public policy. I'm not going to be in the courtroom to convict or exonerate, but I will provide the public policy that can do it. So in New Mexico and in the nation, I feel we have failed to strike the appropriate balance when it comes to the sex offender registration and public notification laws and policy. And this is due largely to the hysteria. We, as I was saying in the last bill, perfect example, this is a case study of legislators who knew in their heart of hearts that this bill was the right thing to do, but as soon as it became hysterical on the floor of the House, over and over again, I could see them dropping out. And the irony, you know, this is the irony to me. It was a sex offender registration bill that dealt with limiting where convicted sex offenders could live. And what is really the bottom line to these limitations on where people can live, it is a killer for the rural areas. Where are these sex offenders going to go? we know they go under bridges, they live under bridges, and they have no homes, so the ability to get them treated at all becomes impossible. The ability to track them becomes impossible, so we've defeated public policy that way. But the second thing is, once you've said you can't live within a half a mile of a church or a school, where can these folks live? In the very area there are no resources. Few, especially in New Mexico. Rural New Mexico has very few policemen who can effectively monitor, and no, and I mean no, people who can treat them. And the other hidden, of course, problem, as you all know here, is once you remove people from the place they live and their family support systems, there's less chance of their ability to get rehabilitated. Because once you remove somebody from the family, and isn't it ironic that the very people that say the foundation of our society is our family, but now those people that need their family the most, we're gonna remove them from living with their families. Okay. So to try to be as concise as possible, I don't even know for sure if we need a registry. If we would go back to indeterminate sentencing, where we gave more power to a judge, a district attorney, and the legal system to say, we now have evidence in a courtroom that this is the second or third offense that this person has committed, and we are going to deal with that individual based on the severity of the problem that we see with this individual, maybe probation and parole is the way to go along with prison sentences. So by saying all of these people, and I can tell you in New Mexico, it was like certain things at a trough when we were writing our first registration bill. And if you'll notice, probably New Mexico has one of the most restrictive registration bills, and that was done while I was chairman of these committees. But it was like, who are these most dangerous people who have problems, psychological, emotional problems that they can't control, as opposed to that person who will never, ever commit that offense again, who was in a specific time or situation in their lives. And I don't know if you all have been following the news in New Mexico, but we just had a big announcement here in New Mexico on this very issue. I don't know if you followed it. There's a little rural community just south of Albuquerque. And about 2 years ago, there was a hazing incident on a football team, and the older classman allegedly sodomized a younger classman. Now that community was dealing with their football stars, who were seen by many of the people in the community as the best and the brightest that community had to offer. And in fact, if you talk to many of the leaders of that community, you would say, we did the very same thing in our day. It was called hazing, and it was dismissed as hazing. And when the plea bargain was announced, just Friday, I believe, you might have seen it on the news, the district attorney specifically said, we have agreed to an offense that will not put these children on the registry and ruin them for the rest of their lives. Specifically, because they saw the registry as not fulfilling the needs of these children. Most of them probably weren't even 18, so I also have problems with the ages. We all know now that not just as it relates to this crime, but many other crimes and many other issues, drug abuse and drug use in America and alcohol use, that brains aren't really fully formed till about age 20, between 25 and 30. So what people are doing in their early ages are doing without the judgment that most of us here in this room would have. It's across the board. People that are involved in drug addiction, people that are involved in sex crimes. We see it over and over again. And the worst thing now that we're learning as it relates to all of these crimes and all of these issues is that the very center of people's brains that is the most developed as young people are the pleasure parts of your brain. We all know how to get pleasure at an early age. What we don't know is how to balance that drive for pleasure with the responsible behavior that is required of human beings that live in a society as they get older. So it's almost like the biology that comes into effect with this specific issue is now being revealed by science as contrary to the actual biological functions that the good Lord made us with. The first was requiring too many sex offenders on the register. The second is requiring them to remain registered for too long. It seems to me that if you are a Christian in America today, the one tenet of Christianity not just is that you believe in Christ, but that Christ's love can change anybody. That is a direct contradiction to the registry. And people who are Christians should not be voting for lifelong registries because they are contradicting their own professed beliefs. The third thing is, of course, we've talked about already, restricting where people live and work. Lastly, passing laws that cannot and will not be paid for, and therefore will not be enforced evenly and appropriately. The irony about all of this is we do this in the name of public safety, and the public is less safe. Our registries are now overloaded and meaningless. And I dug up some statistics. Unfortunately, the last time I had the chance to require the disclosures was in 2007. Let me tell you what we did here in New Mexico in 2007. In 2007 and 2008, we brought in the two top scientists as they relate to sex crimes in America. Jill Levinson, who is a professor in Florida, and Dr. Berlin. We brought them in, and we listened to each of them for a half a day, talking to legislators and the general public about what we could be doing and what we should be doing and what was the latest scientific evidence. And after Dr. Levinson gave her speech, I asked her, well, this is just important information. How many other legislators have you been in front of? And she said, I've been asked in front of one other legislature. I was told I could only talk for 3 minutes, and then they promptly did everything I told them would be a bad idea. So this is what's happening. That here we get somebody who has spent their life trying to figure out how to protect the general public, and the legislatures deny it. But getting back to my other point about, I want to give you a couple of ideas of what's going on. One of our southern, very rural counties in New Mexico is called Chavez County. Back in 2007, they estimated themselves that it was $67,000 the costs to implement their registries that they just didn't have. Doña Ana County, which is a more urban area of New Mexico, says that they didn't have the money to implement it. And Bernalillo County, which is the county you're in now, which is the most urban of all the counties, their unmet need just for their registry was $1.3 million. So, you know, if you have $1.3 million of unmet needs, how can anybody say that these registries are keeping the general public safe? You cannot. You cannot. The money is not there, and the facts don't support it. I want to give you another statistic. The latest number that I've been able to obtain from the New Mexico Department of Corrections is we have about 700 sex offenders in the state of New Mexico in prison right now. They actually couldn't, I couldn't get the number for how many are out of prison, but their number was about 700, and virtually none of them are receiving treatment while in prison. So if you have sex offenders who we know committed an act, many of whom have already pled guilty to those acts, and they're sitting in prison for 8 or 9 years or 10 years or whatever their sentence was, and they're not receiving any help, how many of you think the general public is better off when these folks get out of jail? You know, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So if the whole concept is punishment, well, maybe these laws work, but they work only temporarily, because virtually all of these folks will eventually get out, and whether or not the general public is better off remains to be. And this is another place where the general public is somewhat deceived. They think, oh, registration, that if sex offenders are registered, we know where they are at all times. It's just not true. Now, I actually have seen bracelets which, within 3 meters, will tell law enforcement in real time, every second of the day, where that sex offender is. And in fact, I've now seen bracelet programs which are programmed to say, okay, and this isn't just for sex offenders, it's for murders, it's for everybody. This is the address you're going to be allowed to live at. We're going to program your bracelet so that you can be there between the hours of 8 at night and 8 in the morning. This is the bus route that you're going to take between 8 and 8:30. This is the place where you're going to work and where you can be between 8:30 and whatever. And this is the bus system back at the time of day. And if there's other places you have to go, like your therapist, we can program it to do that too. The interesting thing about it is we are told simultaneously contradictory things. One is it's too expensive because it costs about $12 a day. But we can put these same people in jail, and in New Mexico, the cost for being in jail is $67 a day. What is the general public supposed to believe? And by the way, I'm going to get off on one of my other little tangents and tell you, New Mexico has the highest percentage of prisoners in private prison in the nation. In fact, 100% of our women are in a privatized women's prison. Now, the catch is we also have the highest prison costs in the nation. So if you all think that privatizing is the answer, just refer them to New Mexico, because, and the irony about all of this is, we, in the state system on the men's side, we handle the most notorious and the most violent of all prisoners. We have levels 1 through 6, 1 being close to release, the least violent and the least threat, and 6 being the top threats. And almost 90-some-odd% of what everybody would consider medium prisoners, classified prisoners, 90-some-odd% of those are in the private prison. And we are stuck every year with the bill in a private prison. And we have to deal with the most dangerous prisons in the public prisons. What can and we should be doing? Well, first of all, we should rethink the whole relationship between probation and registration. We should look to see how probation and registration do fit together if, in fact, we need to coordinate between the probation and parole offices and the police. Right now, as I was trying to make this distinction, registration is done by sheriff's offices usually throughout America, and probation and parole is a totally separate office. Sometimes they don't even interact. So what happens when you have a violation of a registration? That person's probation officer may be the last to know. The other is, if we're going to have registration, what is the appropriate level of public notification? If in fact somebody who is identified as dangerous is violating the terms of their registration or probation and parole, when does the general public get notified? Right now, I would say to you that with all the other things that police departments are trying to do just to keep the registration in, what they're able to do in terms of public notification when there is a real threat is minimal. And lastly, as it relates to this specific, if we're going to have these kinds of things of registration and probation and parole, what can we do to convince offenders that they need to take the initiative to seek treatment and not reoffend? You know, it's the most amazing thing. You know, in the 90s in America, we went through this rash of building prisons. I don't know if you've heard, but now the very conservative Republican Speaker of the House of Texas has said, I'm not going to build one more prison while I'm Speaker of the House. It's just too expensive. We are warehousing people that don't belong there, all in the name of public policy. But what I'm getting at is every single one of the directors of the prisons in private will come to me and say, any prisoner who has no chance of ever getting out or getting off a registry has no incentive to change their life. And once you have no incentive, then we are not providing our duty of public safety. Then we also have to ask, if in fact we're going to leave these issues to a registry, how do we make a registry that's effective and not yield to public hysteria? That's an issue that over and over again we're dealing with, that I'm dealing with, that I haven't really come to an answer about, because, as I said earlier, almost all of these are unpaid mandates, unfunded mandates, and so how can I say to the policeman, look, if you find an offender who is violating the terms of their registration, now I want you to make 100 phone calls to anybody who might be in danger. Every police chief in New Mexico, eyes glaze over when I start saying that. And the obvious thing here is with our laws. Have we now made our laws so broad that, and so ill-conceived, that those people who have no real danger of committing this crime again are swept up and labeled for the rest of their lives, especially at young ages? When we so diffuse our efforts, it makes it impossible for us to provide the resources to ensure public safety and to help the victims. And by the way, I want you to know one other anecdotal piece of evidence. And again, the problem here in New Mexico is I can't get empirical data just out of the state of New Mexico. It's not enough. But what I'm hearing from the police themselves is they are now telling me that we have made the laws so harsh that family members won't turn in other family members because they don't want the stigma to the entire family, especially in a small community. So the problem is everybody in that family may be alerted that Uncle so-and-so is doing this to all the nieces and nephews. But what happens when nobody else in that little community knows that he'll walk down the street and maybe do it to a child of somebody else's family, the neighbor or somebody else? So there has become this disincentive to actually report sex crimes, which again prevents us from really understanding the full scope of the problem and how do we focus our problems to make the public even safer. And unfortunately, this means that families many times who don't have the resources are left on their own to cope with this problem. In New Mexico, we have a huge percentage of our population, one of the highest in the nation, of uninsured. So that means that this uncle may not have the kind of insurance, or the families may not have the kind of insurance that they need to try to find treatment. And then even if they did, who do they go to? Because unfortunately, New Mexico, like most states, say you have to report. And if you have to report, how do you find treatment if the very thing you're trying to do is keep it out of the... And next, my big problem with Adam Walsh and much of what what's happened throughout the nation in the states is we are defining people by the offense for which that person is convicted, not for the actual event that took place. So what that means is you reward sex offenders with the best attorneys, because the best attorneys will get plea bargains that will not convey to probation and parole, sheriffs and registries, the actual violence or the actual events that took place. That some kid that's involved in a hazing accident as a high school football player is the same as the predator who has been in 4 different states committing horrendous acts as coaches. And by the way, I want you to know, I've seen this on both sides, and my heart goes out to these families. I have a very close friend whose family was devastated by a coach in a soccer league who molested his child and other children on the team. And the laws proved totally ineffective. That predator virtually walked free, and still to this day is not on the list. Unbelievable. So, in effect, because it's easier and cheaper for everybody in the system, we're saying, oh, we can just objectify every single crime along the way. That the crime of sexual penetration in the first degree in New Mexico is the same no matter if there was extreme violence or if there was virtually no violence, or even if it's the 23-year-old who dates the 14-year-old and whose parents turn the 23-year-old in. And so these objective standards we're finding are not working. And what it also means is 2 people that commit the exact same crime are treated differently. And that is a violation of the number one idea of public policy, that the law will treat everybody equally. The problem is, even though you might even have the exact same crime, that doesn't mean that the perpetrator is actually going to reoffend, that 2 separate perpetrators will reoffend at the same rate. So as we rush to objectify because it's the cheapest and easiest, we aren't really getting at the problem, nor does it take into account the needs of the victims, that one victim may, through great family, strong ties within the family, might be able to recover better than another victim who doesn't have those same resources. I'm not going to talk too much about the Adam Walsh Act. I suppose you know a lot about it. And so I just want to say that initially, when we were first given the first briefings of what was in the Adam Walsh Act, many of the initial ideas of not allowing the most serious predators to just escape notice by going from state to state made some sense. But once politicians in Washington started piling on, the act became almost meaningless. And let me give you an example. It's so ironic because it's in the news today. The very reason we were told we had to enact the provisions of the Adam Walsh Act in New Mexico was that we would lose federal funding if we didn't. Now, does this sound familiar? This is the Obamacare Act, that, hey, if you don't do all these things, you don't get the money that comes with Medicaid for the... So it was the exact same argument made by the exact opposite side of the aisle. The irony about all of that is, unlike some, let me just say some, we then demanded, and it took us almost a year and a half to get, but we demanded, okay, you're saying we're going to lose money, how much is it? And quite frankly, in the state of New Mexico, we determined it wasn't worth it. That the money that they were trying to hold over our head was not worth the amount of money we would have to spend to come into compliance. And I haven't gotten all the latest statistics about which states are in compliance. I know the number has grown, but what I knew about what states were in compliance, most of those states, like for instance, the first state, Ohio, they got into compliance because the Bush Justice Department gave them waivers of all the most onerous conditions of the Adam Walsh Act because they were so anxious to have one state in compliance. Think of how embarrassing it is to the great crusaders on their white horses to pass this law, and the states all ignore it. So they started issuing waivers to Ohio and then claimed that Ohio was leading the pack. Well, some of us knew better and still know better. It went far overboard on the requirements for registration, even for misdemeanors. It required the states to redo their entire code and reclassify certain crimes. It required that we reclassify crimes and punishments retroactively. And it required registration of juveniles, and New Mexico just decided we weren't going to go there. I have a quote, Dr. Levinson from Lynn University in Florida, when she came and testified that day. I want to give you one quote from her, which I think is somewhat ironic, and we'll talk about it after I read the quote. Broad policies targeting all sex offenders and that disregard research on risk, recidivism, and responsiveness to care are akin to the emperor's new clothes. People see what they want to see, despite evidence to the contrary. The shared illusion becomes a perceived reality, and even those who may question what they see become afraid to articulate observations that are politically and socially undesirable. The media play a critical role in the shaping of public opinion about sex offenders. It is unfortunate that a great deal of inaccurate information is promulgated by the media, which serves as a primary source of information for citizens and often for politicians. Enormous coverage of heartbreaking but rare cases involving child abduction and murder by previously convicted sex offender leads to the public's inability to distinguish between the severity of some sexual reoffenses and the likelihood of reoffending. Misinformation leads to poorly developed social policies that are unlikely to enhance public safety, and the passage of ineffective laws results in a truly ineffective use of resources. Reshaping public opinion through the widespread dissemination of factual information is a first step in advocating evidence-based social policies that will be more successful in protecting our children. current strategies are unlikely to achieve their goal of facilitating community services. Maybe I didn't need to talk for the first 20 minutes here. I just could have read this and I would have saved you most of your morning. I did think it was a little ironic that she used the emperor's new clothes, because that was a sex offense, as I remember it, because he paraded in a public place without his clothes on. So at the time I said, "Doctor, please, could you find a different analogy the next time you speak?" She said she'd try. And later, when we had Dr. Berlin, and for those of you that don't know, Dr. Berlin, he initially came to prominence because he was suggesting chemical castration. And so some of our more conservative members of our legislature wanted him to come, and I brought him in so that we could get all sides of the issue. What dismayed many of my conservatives, because when they expected Dr. Berlin when they came to hear him talk, basically what he said was, "I agree with virtually everything I've heard Dr. Levinson told you earlier." So that's my speech for the day. I just hope that as we move forward on public policy, we can find solutions that will mend families of the victims and the perpetrators, and that we can find a public policy that will do the best for all of our citizens. So thank you all very much.
Senator, I'm Janice Bellucci from California, the state organizer there, RSOL, and I'm very struck by the statistics you've given us about your prison system here in New Mexico. And I'm wondering if you believe that there might be something called a prison industrial complex.
Yes. Easy question, easy answer.
Would you elaborate?
In fact, this was one of the famous fights I had with my leadership in the legislature. When you make it a profit to put somebody in prison, and you know, these guys with the prison industry, oh boy, they'll tell you, you tell us whatever you want in the way of treatment and we'll do it all. We'll be the best treatment in the world. And when you start looking at the prices of what that costs, it doesn't happen. And not only that, it's gone in the wrong direction. We've virtually done away at one point in New Mexico in the private prison with our prison industries. So you had a whole bunch of guys sitting around in prison with nothing to do. I'm here because for 28 years I've been involved in Judiciary Committee of the state of New Mexico, either chairman or vice chairman for most of those years. And throughout those years, I've taken on controversial issues, including this. And we have had in New Mexico some of the most thorough legislative hearings of any state in the nation on sex offender and sex offender laws. My message today is that the politicians are failing our people because we're not using the best resources and the best policies to keep our public safe. We have overdone and piled on, and politicians are claiming that they're the toughest on crimes when in fact what they do is counterproductive to ensuring the safety of our people. I'm not an advocate for anybody in particular. All I'm trying to do is create good public policy. And unfortunately, what's happened in America because of hysteria of individual events, we have created public laws that don't fit the need for public safety. And on top of that, when we pass these laws, really what we're doing is creating unfunded mandates. The federal government has done it, the state legislature has done it, and all of this falls onto our local communities who can't afford the requirements. The one statistic that I do have is from 2007 in Bernalillo County. We have an unfunded mandate in sex offender laws to our local community of $1.3 million. So not only are we paying for the administration, but we're paying because those that are the most dangerous sex offenders are able to slip through because we can't focus on those we should be focusing on, and more victims suffer because we aren't focusing our efforts properly. When we've included misdemeanors and all these other crimes that were one-time events, many times committed by juveniles who committed a horrible crime, but not the kind of crime that would indicate what they're going to do as an adult and the life they'll lead as an adult. And so those juveniles are put on the registry for the rest of their lives, and they never commit again. The fact of the matter is, overwhelmingly, most sex offenders never commit another sex crime for the rest of their lives.
And that's
We need to create a public policy that makes the public safe, that helps the families who are the victims of these crimes, and that acknowledges the true costs of what are the laws that we're passing. There is no 100% fail-safe method of predicting who is a predator and who is not a predator. But we're getting much better at determining those people who are not predators. What we have to learn to do now, and we have to spend public resources, is trying to figure out who are the real predators. In the long run, it's going to be cheaper for us in America to try to figure out who has the most psychological problems that cause them to be predators and key our resources on those people. And we can do that, we just haven't spent the resources doing it. All those people that are on the registry, we're already incurring all those costs. We're incurring longer prison sentences, and we're incurring many of those costs on the registry, and that's why the registries are breaking down.